Welcome to Taking the Higher Road, the DriverReach and FreightWaves production. I'm your host, Jeremy Reymer, founder and CEO of DriverReach, a modern recruiting and compliance software solution. On this show, I interview industry experts and thought leaders who bring their insights to the driver lifecycle as we discuss the industry's greatest challenges, driver recruiting, retention, and compliance. I appreciate all the positive feedback on the show. Please remember to rate and review Taking the Higher Road, whatever platform you use to listen. This week, it's my honor to host a great friend from my earliest days in the trucking industry, someone I feel like I've grown up with in the industry alongside, for the past 15 plus years. A great leader and a great family man with a genuine heart of gold, President and CEO of Bestway Express, Eli McCormick. So glad to have you on the show, brother.
Thanks for having me, Jeremy. Appreciate the warm welcome. I don't know if those words are as true as what you make them sound, but I appreciate it nonetheless.
Well, they're true to me and they're true to everybody else who knows you.
Fair enough.
We've been through a lot together, from our early days, learning about trucking industry advocacy in Indiana, the founding of the Future Leaders of Indiana, something that was also modeled by ATA's Lead ATA program, to leading our respective companies and building, or in your case, carrying on a legacy. I'm excited to share your story with the audience. Who is Eli McCormick, the leader of a third-generation family business? I'm hoping you're okay with us talking about the tragedy that accelerated your leadership responsibilities and how you're carrying on in the legacy in an ever-evolving industry. And then we can talk about the importance of industry involvement and engagement at both the state and national level. And then I'd also love to get your insights on the importance of leveraging technology, both in cab and in your operations. And then lastly, if we can get to all of this, I want to make sure that we have time to answer a question from a listener during our deeper dive segment. Think we can knock all this down?
Give it a shot, man.
Well, as is the custom, generally before we dive in, I usually ask if there's any sort of a book or podcast or anything that you might recommend for the audience, anything maybe recent or just really impactful that you've read.
Yeah. So actually, I think you and I were talking about this the other day when we had lunch together, but I recently read, you might laugh, but I read Matthew McConaughey's Green Lights book, and not typically maybe something from a leadership perspective that you're going to say, oh man, that's going to be fantastic. But I was pleasantly surprised because he talked about his life and the resemblance between his life and like with kind of my dad's life. It was somewhat uncanny. And, the book is about his stories and his life and taking you, from his early age to his success and all that stuff. And he talks a lot about, the red lights and the yellow lights and the green lights, which the book is called. And, it talks about green lights being the positive things in his life. And it talks about the red lights, the things that, like in my case, a lot of tragedy and my story and stuff. And how do you turn that to a positive? So I was intrigued by that one. That was a good read. It's also on Audible. So if you want to hear Matthew McConaughey and his Southern drawl read his own book to you, that's a good one. The one I'm reading right now is called Leadership in Turbulent Times. It's a Pulitzer Prize book. It's pretty good. I'm about halfway through it, but it's it follows I think 5 or 6 presidents and it talks about the challenges that they went through during their times of challenges and turbulent times. And I think it reflects very well right now because my company specifically, and I know a lot of others out there, kind of on their way through, these turbulent times that we're going through right now, dealing with a pandemic, and now we're, starting to see some recessionary, issues that are coming on. And so trucking always has its challenges, to say the least. So this has been kind of a good one to kind of look at some of the leaders of our country in the past and kind of how they've handled some of these times. So it's kind of intriguing. Like I said, I'm about halfway through it, but I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, a couple of great recommendations. I'm not familiar with Green Lights, but I wrote that down, especially if for no other reason. I just want to hear that Southern drawl, right? And then
it's good. It's funny. It's a good one. It's a quick read.
Now the other one that's Doris Kearns Goodwin, and I've read that and I love it. In fact, I think I've mentioned it on the show before to a few listeners, and I love history, right? And so, yeah, that's a great one. I think you'll really like that. So anxious to hear your thoughts on the other side of it. Take us down memory lane, if you will. How did Bestway Express come to be?
Yep. So Bestway Express, we were formed in 1981, but roots go a little bit deeper than that. My grandpa, you mentioned I'm third generation. That is accurate. My grandpa was in it much earlier than that. He started in the 1940s. He grew up on a farm just south of our town. We're located in Vincennes, Indiana, which is in southwestern Indiana, and my grandpa was a farm boy. My great-grandfather was actually the Secretary of Agriculture under Truman, believe it or not. So when my great-grandpa was in Washington, D.C., my grandfather was tasked with taking over the farm, and in doing so, he fell in love with heavy equipment, more specifically trucks and hauling produce. So he got his start in the 40s into the trucking world, hauling produce up into the Chicagoland area. And fast forward into the 50s, he purchased a little bit different side of the business. He got into the dealership side of the world, and he held the dealership for almost 60 years before we sold those in the early to mid 2000s. And during that time as well, he had an opportunity to get into the LTL world, and he purchased an LTL company and held it for, I want to say, probably 20 years or so. He sold right before deregulation, and so that was in, I want to say, mid to late 70s, so really kind of pushing the bucket on that. At the time of kind of when we became a company as Bestway Express, my father was home from school, trying to get into veterinarian school at the time, and he was running the parts departments for my grandfather's dealerships. And 1980 rolled around. We went through a recession, like we were talking about a minute ago. Went through a recession. We had a local farmer who had recently purchased 3 or 4 trucks off of my grandfather's dealership here locally, and unfortunately was unable to fulfill, that order. So my grandpa repossessed the trucks, and he took his authority for payment. And about a week later, because he had some choices to make, do I try to resell the trucks, probably going to lose money on it, or do I take the authority and try to do something with it? So at the time, like I mentioned, my dad was running the parts department. I have an uncle who at the time was working out in, I believe, North Carolina for FFE, believe it or not. And I'm not quite sure what he was doing, but I think it was something to do with either driving a truck or doing something in the warehouse for them. And so Grandpa kind of had this epiphany, like, hey, I've got all the mechanisms to do this. I've got 2 sons who are interested in doing it, and so I think we should do it. So he called my dad into his office about a week later and said, Mac, hey, I want you to do this. I want you to start this trucking company. Here's the trucks that we have. Here's the authority. And basically, Dad said, okay. So my Uncle Pat, who is still in the business, he moved home, and they started Bestway Express in 1981. We began, so my grandmother's side, on my dad's side, that we've got ties. She's got ties. She's from Jasper, Indiana, and Jasper, Indiana is known for the furniture, their furniture making and building and stuff. So at the time, they were shipping a lot of that furniture out to the East Coast. So Bestway got its start by hauling furniture out to the East Coast cities like New York City, Philadelphia, Baltimore, big cities like that, metropolitan areas. And then they were tasked with hauling raw trash back into central Indiana. So that was the early days of Bestway Express. If you fast forward just a few years later, we had a local facility here in town, which was the Johnson Controls automotive plant. And the gentleman that had that contract, the freight contract, was a good friend of my dad's. And they kind of joined forces, and that's kind of how we got our start, which we still primarily haul today, which is automotive parts. So we experienced growth pretty quick. Like I said, we started with like 4 trucks, and within about 7 or 8 years, we had grown to about 100 trucks. Started with the contract here in Vincennes with the automotive stuff, and then we went down to Western Kentucky, which is over in Cadiz, Kentucky at the time. There's a Johnson Controls facility there. We grew another probably 50 or 60 trucks in that operation, and then just a few short years later, we ended up over in Eastern Kentucky, in Georgetown, Kentucky, at the Johnson Controls facility there, where we grew another 50 or 60 trucks. So that is kind of the footprint which we still have today. Home base is here in Vincennes, Indiana, which is southwestern Indiana. We've got a hub in Western Kentucky now. It's moved just a few miles away from Cadiz into Hopkinsville. And then also we still have our hub over in Georgetown, Kentucky, which again is in Eastern Kentucky, which is Toyota World. So that's kind of who we are. That's what we do. Today we're operating about 225 trucks-ish. Got about 450 trailers, still predominantly are hauling automotive parts. It makes up about 75 to 80% of our business. Last few years, like a lot of companies have done, we've gone out, we tried to diversify a little bit. So about 15% of our business, about 12% of our business, we haul bourbon and spirits out of the Louisville, Kentucky market, which has been very good for us. And then we've recently kind of gotten into some
Quite a bit of diversity. See, your father, you mentioned him, Mac, was leading Bestway Express, and in fact was about to become the ATA's chairman.
Correct. Yeah.
Tragedy, tragedy struck in May 2006 as the small plane he was flying crashed, and I think you and I first met, I mean, within a month or so after that. And I remember talking to you about that and really empathizing with what you and your family were going through. Do you mind, or can you share, just what that tragedy, or how that tragedy, altered your trajectory in the business as the youngest of Mac's 3 sons, who all work in the business today, right?
Yep. Yeah, so I'll back up a little bit. So I graduated from Indiana State University in May of 2006, and for years prior, it's a family business, so you can imagine how that goes. But for years, our father would always say, hey, you don't want to come back and do this, you don't want to do it. It's too stressful. It's, it's got its qualms, but it's also rewarding and stuff. I think in reality, he probably thought we were going to come back and screw it up. So, we kind of had that in the back of our heads that, we were probably going to go do something else. So as graduation was approaching for me and out of college, I was looking at other options and had some other stuff on the table. Much to my surprise, about a month prior to me graduating, my father came to me and said, hey, we just bought this third-party logistics company. We're looking for salespeople. I think you'd be really good at it. And I said, well, I've got other options on the table, so what are we talking about? I think that kind of like made him take a step back for a minute, and but ultimately we worked out a deal. And what I told him was, hey, I want to learn the business from the inside out if I want to come into sales, so put me in operations, and then I'll eventually go into sales for you. He said, that's fine, but I'm going to give you 6 months to do it. So I started back, we're getting close to 17 years. I think next week will be my 17th year anniversary. But I started back in May of 2006. Like you mentioned, Dad was the incoming chairman of the American Trucking Association. He was supposed to be inaugurated in October, and about a week prior to that, he was on a speaking engagement up in Wisconsin. Amongst all of his, business successes, he was also a pilot. As was my grandfather. And so to get to that meeting, he was on a time crunch. So what he did was he had flown from our local airport, his personal plane up to Indianapolis, caught a commercial flight to Chicago, then drove up into Wisconsin to do a speaking engagement. And obviously on the way back, same scenario, just in reverse. Well, when he got from Chicago back to Indianapolis, they sat on the tarmac because of a mechanical issue, or weather had moved in, or they couldn't get the gate to come pick him up off the plane, or whatever it was. But he sat out there for about 45 minutes. And by that time, weather started to move in, and he had the option to drive home from Indianapolis, which is about a 2.5-hour drive, or to fly his plane, which is about a 27-minute flight. So ultimately, he chose to do that. Dad had been a pilot since he was 16, so it wasn't like he was new to it. He was 55 years old at the time of his death, and that's kind of how it went down. He had gotten back all the way to Lawrenceville, weather had moved in, made his first approach. The curtain had kind of come down on the clouds so low that he had to pull back up and then, come back around, and we don't know for sure, but we're 99% sure that, when he was making his pass back around to re-land, that it suffered a heart attack, and the plane climbed in altitude, speed didn't climb. Ultimately, plane stalled out, and that was it. At the time, like I said, that was in October of 2006, so I was almost to the date of him telling me, hey, you got 6 months to learn what you can, then I'm putting you out on the road to do sales, was about the time that accident happened. So, it's alarming. You go from being a 22-year-old kid that, at the time, absolutely knew nothing about trucking, just graduated college, had 6 months of experience in operations, which really just, at that point, you're still learning lingo, you're still learning, culture, you're still learning all those things that it takes time. And I woke up the next day and it was, oh my gosh, I'm no longer just a kid in operations now, and it may sound dramatic, but now I have the responsibility of close to 400 lives at the time, responsibility for making the right decisions and doing the right things and all that. So it was a lot. It definitely made me grow up quick. You ask about, what effect that has, on such a young person is trying to figure out. I don't know that I ever really properly took the time to grieve just because you didn't have time to do it. But I'll tell you, the most fortunate part about the whole thing is that I had strong leadership in the organization at the time. So it wasn't, although I was putting those pressures on myself because I thought I needed to do that. I probably really, truly didn't need to because we had strong leadership in the organization at the time, and ones that were willing to fill the gap until myself or one of my brothers was ready to step up and do this thing. So kudos to them for doing that, because not everybody would do that. And we're fortunate that we got through a lot of those tough times. We went through a recession pretty close after all that happened. And of course, I won't get into the whole tax debt thing and all that, but it really did put a strain on us. And it took us about a decade to get through all that just to get back to even par. So lots of challenges. It was a wake-up call for me that, it was funny. Like when I was interviewing with my father, he's like, well, what do you want to do? I'm like, I said, well, I don't really need a career. I'm still young and all that stuff. And then it's funny just how it works out 6 months later. It's like, boom, you're thrown into the lion's den, and it's definitely a sink or swim moment. You guys probably seen the movie Tommy Boy. I really felt a lot like, Chris Farley in that movie a lot of my life in my early to mid-20s, traveling around the country trying to save the company and all that stuff. But, all joking aside, I want to thank the people who are here that had the leadership, to step up and fill that void and get us ready to take this thing over, a few years later.
Well, you mentioned, thanks for sharing that. I know that's, it can be pretty emotional. And I certainly recall when like I said earlier, when we first met, and it was recent and challenging. You said 17 years, right? So, you've seen the industry change some. Can you maybe share a little bit about, how it's changed or evolved, and how you've adapted, how Bestway's adapted along the way?
Yeah, so us specifically. So like, again, just from the commodity that we haul, we've always had the philosophy that we're going to get everybody home, more than what the general trucking public is going to do that. What's changed for us is I feel like that a lot of, or not for us, what's changed in the industry, that a lot of the industries kind of picked up on that model where supply chains have kind of changed to hub and spokes, where it's allowed drivers, and rightfully so, allowed drivers to get home on a more consistent basis. So that created challenges for us because no longer were we able just to sell the fact that, hey, we're going to get you home more often. So that, that's one big thing. And another one is obviously the price of equipment. Equipment's, obviously gone through the roof, especially here in probably the last 5 or 6 years. So that's been a bit of a challenge just because, this is a very capital intensive business that we're in. A lot of people don't understand that until they really start to look at it. So, when equipment goes up, rates and everything else, kind of have to go up too, to kind of follow suit. And, consequently maintenance can pick up as well. And so that's a big change. The things that really haven't changed in our world is how we treat drivers and how we treat employees. Maybe in the industry, it used to be a numbers game where it's like, not to pick on bigger ones because I don't necessarily think it's just the big ones doing it, but a lot of times, just from a recruiting and retention, you hear it all the time that, oh, well, so-and-so lied to me and so-and-so did that. We've kind of hung our hat on the fact that we're probably honest to our detriment to sometimes, where we're not trying to sugarcoat things. We're trying to give them a real experience stuff. So that hadn't really changed on our end. I think from an industry standpoint, though, that it's changed for the better to where that honesty is now coming out, and it has been for quite some time. But when I first started 17 years ago, it was pretty much, you say you do whatever you can to get a driver in here. I feel like that's changed for the better, definitely.
Well, I know how much you value culture, and I know you personally. I know you pretty well, and I know your brothers very well, and I know Pat. You mentioned Pat. I know Pat well, and I know how important that is to you. Can you share, how important company culture is and core values are, when it comes to retaining drivers, and how does Bestway foster, a more positive culture for its employees?
Yeah, so that's a hard thing to capture. I kind of mentioned a little bit about as far as, how do you differentiate yourself from the next guy? A lot of companies in this industry are family owned and operated, and we're no different. Like I said, we're third generation. So, we kind of we hang our hat on that, but how do you differentiate yourself from that? So about 6 or 7 years ago, had a young lady approach me about doing an internship for us. And I'm like, okay, well, what do you want to do? She said, well, I'll learn anything and everything you can about business and all that stuff. I said, oh, okay, let's talk about it. Why don't you come in? Let's have a conversation. Well, she did that. And, I recognized pretty quickly with her that, she's younger, right? So she knows the technology piece a little bit better than what anybody else in this company did. Most of our employees here have been here for quite some time. So, not all, but, obviously even myself included, you got 17 years under your belt, you're starting to get up in the age, so technology, specifically like social media, isn't necessarily one of our fine suits, or wasn't prior to that. So bringing her on to take over that, was a huge success for us, because we're not real good about patting ourselves on the back. We do the right thing, always. I mean, that's kind of our motto: do the right thing always. And, but we're not always so good about telling that story. And I think as a whole, as industry as a whole, I think the industry is kind of the same way. So bringing her in to kind of capture some of that stuff and kind of just illustrate and picture frame some of the things that we actually do well, especially for our employees and our drivers, has been a big key. Some of those things, we're no different than anybody else, but, we make a big deal about Driver Appreciation Week. We cook every day, morning, lunch, dinner, scenarios and at different locations as well. We recognize drivers on a monthly basis, through our safety platform that we use with our dash cams and stuff like that. So culture is a big thing, but the biggest thing for us is, we reckon this is kind of my dad's thing, and I'm trying to take it on as well, and I've done pretty well with that. But we've got an open door policy here, and more so than just telling the drivers that, hey, you've got a voice here, showing them that they have a voice has been probably the biggest thing that we've been able to do. So with the exception of right now, my door is closed, but for the most part, my door is open all the time. So if at any rank, if anybody wants to come in and have a conversation about what's going on, it's an open invite to do so. And I think that's important. It doesn't matter what size of a company you are. You gotta keep that level available, and transparency is key, whether it's good or bad or indifferent. I think communication with all your employees is important, but especially the drivers, because they're out there, they're out there on the road on a daily basis for hours at a time, and they're going to resonate with the last thing that was said to them, whether that's good or bad or indifferent. So our big thing about culture is, always into conversation, especially in operations, or it could be in, accounting or with the shop. Don't leave the conversation with an angry tone, or, telling a driver to go get bent or whatever. You can't do that. Right. And so I think we've done a pretty good job about that.
Well, now we've got a couple minutes left, and I've got 2 questions. One, including the deeper dive question. So switching gears a little bit, I want to talk about industry involvement and engagement for a minute, because I mentioned earlier that you and I were part of I think there were like 8 to 10 other young leaders in Indiana that formed, Future Leaders of Indiana. And it was the right time for all of us. We've all been super close ever since. And I say all the time how great relationships you can build in this industry, the relationships that can last a lifetime. How much of an impact would you say that personal involvement in the industry at the IMTA as well as TCA and ATA, how much did that help you as a young leader?
Well, so jumping in at the age of 22, like I said, I didn't know anything, right? So it was key for me. So let's talk about the young leaders group that we've got. And, it was key to me to be in a room full of guys and gals that maybe not in the same boat, but close to the same age, close to the same demographic, that are kind of up and comers of their companies and stuff like that. So early on, like you said, within a year, I think, of me coming on to here, let me get a drink. So very early on, coming into that and being in that setting and seeing how all that works. I can't tell you, you brought the relationship piece, but, and the networking and stuff, but some of the people that we met in that room that day are some of my best friends, even to this day. And at this point, that's been 16 years ago. I talk frequently to a good handful of those people still, yourself included, today. And then on a national stage, I was part of TCA's young group before ATA's group came on, and same thing with that. There's several in that group that I'm still very close to today. And when you go to these national meetings and stuff, you talk about you're going for education, you're going to be a part of the networking group, but you're going to be a part of a bigger picture, and going there and actually being able to know people when you go there, it makes it a little bit less scary, because it can be, a little bit overwhelming if you're walking into this room of thousands of people and you don't know anybody, and that's one of those things for the young group. I think that's the key. Probably the most important thing is to build those relationships. And that's my biggest hope for anybody that goes to those programs, that they have the success that like you and I had, from a relationship building standpoint, because, Jeremy, I'll call you and it may be about work or it may not be about work. Our good friend Lance Regal, Lance is my insurance guy, and he wasn't at the time, but I know that if I've got a problem with it personally or professionally, I can call Lance anytime, any hour, and he's going to pick up and he's going to give me the advice that either I need to hear or, maybe don't want to hear sometimes. But it's key. And it's one of those things that you want to go through this journey. And we've said it before, when we were starting the young leaders thing, once you're into transportation and logistics, you're probably going to stay in transportation and logistics. So you might as well find a core group of people that you want to go through it with, because that's what we're doing. We're spending life together, and we may not see each other every single day, but the nice thing is about true friendships is, and you'll build them in these types of settings, is that it could be 6 months, it could be a year, which it probably won't be, but it could be some time that passes, and more than likely you're going to pick right up, where you left off. To me, that's been, especially at a young age, that's been probably the most important thing that helped me with my development, my leadership, and everything else. And now to be able to carry that, 15, 16, 17 years later, and now I'm working with a lot of you guys, which is great.
Well, there's a lot that I still want to talk about, and I know we're at the end of our time today. I do want to talk about, because I know, again, we're so involved in the industry and engaged, that I think some pretty important topics, whether that's electric vehicles or 18 to 20-year-olds getting behind a wheel. And so I'm hoping that you'd be willing to have another conversation with me where we can unpack some of those things and share that. And then in that scope, we'll ask the deeper dive question that we're not going to be able to get to today because it just is too much to cover. I knew that was daunting, but I really appreciate your time. I'm grateful for our relationship and certainly appreciate your dedication to this industry.
Absolutely. Appreciate your time. Thanks for inviting me on, and I look forward to another conversation.
And thanks for joining me for another episode of Taking the High Road and spreading the word to your industry peers. We really appreciate it. And remember, you can submit any questions or comments, including those which may appear on upcoming deeper dive segments, at podcast@driverreach.com. And don't forget to rate and review Taking the High Road, whatever platform you use to listen. Until next time, thank you for taking the higher road.